Hello, friends. Um, let's see. My name is Travis. People call me TW. I've been working in Web3 since 2020. I work as a UX researcher and a UI designer and a DAO strategist. Um, I'm a contributor to Rave Guild and DAO House and Gitcoin and various other projects in the space. I think everyone here knows that. I'm also an artist and a musician and a philosopher. So today I have the privilege of being able to share with you some of these projects that are very near and dear to me that I don't often discuss in Web3 circles. For the past 5 years or so, I've lived off-grid in a unique Earthship house in northern New Mexico. And just this year, I've transformed this house into a residency program. And this is very much informed by my experience contributing to the Web3 ecosystem. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this experiment today. Also, it's worth noting that this presentation is peppered with some brief audio interludes. So make sure that your volume is up when we get there. This music that I'm going to share with you was all made by myself and also my collaborator, Curtis Tam. And we have a project together called Perpeteia. So pretty soon, I hope it will become clear why we're taking this time to sit and listen to some of this material together. But before we get to those details, allow me to provide you a very quick overview of what we're going to cover today. So the first part of this presentation, we will question the context of this symposium itself, specifically the local or these practices of localism. And I know this is now the end. I believe this is actually maybe the final talk of this, what I believe is over a month long of talks. So certainly this concept has been thoroughly unfurled at this point, but I would like to take a little time to explore this problem space in my own way and maybe attempt to reconfigure some of the meanings of this term and this concept in relation to creative work and the broader implications that an artistic practice of localism might offer or lend itself to the Web3 space. In the second part, I'll apply this concept of the local to the residency program that I've been experimenting with, that we have been experimenting with. This program is called TEARS, which is short for the 3 Years Attenuation Residency Site. And it's currently in a very nascent state. So it's very much under development and in collaboration with the neighbors of the physical locale, as well as the attendees that have come from all over the world to help me understand what this thing is. So I'll try to illustrate how the TEARS program serves as a site for experimenting with locality across both physical and digital realms. And in the third section here, we will discuss Perpeteia, which is a multimodal performative project that performs an ontological practice of locality. At least that's how we think of it. So I'll briefly mention how Perpeteia works with these ideas of locality specifically in various ways, and particularly within the realm of our interest in the sonic and sensual praxis in exploring the expanded field of awareness. And then finally, in the fourth section, I'll try to speculate some, we'll see how the fourth section goes. This is all an experiment. So I'll try to speculate some potential applications of these ideas towards the technosphere and try to connect some of our learnings with the decentralized and autonomous technologies of the Web3 space specifically. But before we begin, we've already begun, so after the beginning, but again, before we begin, let's just take a minute to pause and listen. Okay, yes, I see a question. This music was recorded at TEARS, and I will touch on that again in a moment. But first, I would like to address this concept of the local, of localism, and things pertaining to locality. This is the prompt that we were invited into the context that we find ourselves in today. So I propose that the idea of the local designates a partitioning of space. It's the threshold surrounding and identifying a self or an entity, the space that defines and individuates personhood. In this current strange and surreal socio-political climate that we find ourselves in, I believe that the grand narrative of localism really begins with identifying this threshold of the self as a body, as an agency, as a singular mind, and extends outwards from there. So this extension constrains a discourse regarding where subjective spaces begin and overlap with each other in the world. It forms the basis for inevitably politicized discussions around ownership of personal space, familial territories acquired through violence and passed down through genetic processions, the formation of arbitrary nations and states, along with all of their jurisdictional power dynamics. The colloquial usage of locality identifies this threshold of individuation and extends outward into the world, onto the world. It's composed of overlapping layers of these variously privatized, yet always already shared spaces. However, I would like to propose today that we reconsider the emphasis on compartmentalized space and delineated territories. And instead of using these spectral thresholds as an impetus for scrutinizing outwards, we might choose to peer inward toward the root of a common tether, towards a shifted foundation of the once universal become pluriversal. So I'd like us to entertain the potential of inciting an ontological pivot at the site of locality. A shift in an inward gaze allows us to articulate the individual as always already enmeshed in contextual relation to and with the environment, entangled in selves already arrived before us, defined a priori relational embeddedness. This constitutes a focus on the ground rather than the figure, in the traditional gestalt of figure-ground relations. So by making this subtle shift, by not changing the threshold so much, but altering our orientation upon the locus of focus itself, we can begin to understand the relatedness of the structures that compose this self, to reorient to the ontological language we use to articulate ourselves to ourselves. So we might begin again from a place of commonality and shared cohabitation. And from this disposition, we can start to dismantle the universal and universalizing languages based in ownership of territorialized realms. And instead, we might move towards a way of relating that is motivated by relinquishing any such ownership and considering a common responsibility to steward and care for the others among us. Identifying opportunities for cohabitating with them in shared spaces and opening thresholds rather than closing them off into partitions. This approach, I think, allows us to occupy a more porous and diffuse relationality with each other, with any other for that matter, and especially those that might defy identification as individuated persons at all. So this offers a much more, I think, fruitful and generative way of thinking about local proximity. So allow me to repeat this phrase, the locus of focus. This playful semantic turning reminds us of the Latin origin of the term local, locus, a site and a place of focus. So the local begins as a site of intellectual positioning before it becomes an externalized relational dynamic between bodies and spaces and places. We should consider the locality of our intellectual communities, the often disastrous, disembodied, mimetic echo chambers we find ourselves in, or rather are often losing ourselves in, and consider how locality in this context can be both a generative and limiting factor, providing the constraints of our capacity to perceive self and its relations. So locality is a physical and physiological and philosophical site of contemplation, a locality of body and intellect, of repositioning and dispositions. This is admittedly a rather metaphysical take on locality, as you know, who you are and who you tend to find community with unconsciously adds layers to that flickering self in question. And to this extent, locality might not be the preferred or ideal starting point for these meditations. The context of this term seems to be an attempt to bridge the gap between the dissociative and alienating territorialization that arises from disembodied media. So the ubiquitous screen mediation and the symptoms of dissociative alienation that result. And I think that the hope is for a kind of reconciliation through a return to the physical, somehow going back to the land, touching grass, as they say. So yes, this dichotomy is admittedly and uncomfortably metaphysical and somewhat counterintuitive for me. So we need to address and reconfigure it together. But going any deeper down that path is beyond the scope of this presentation today. Still, it is important to raise these points, I think, and even if we don't resolve them, by addressing locality from these multiple perspectives and including the potential limitations of the term, we open up a space for further contemplation. Okay, part two. In this section, I will try to softly apply this meditation on locality to a specific site. And that site is the 3 Years Attenuation Residency site. So the word attenuation in this acronym is something we carefully considered when naming the program. So initially the name was going to be the 3 Years Artist Residency site, which would be decidedly more familiar and evoke a common organizational archetype. Everyone knows what an artist residency is. However, we wanted to broaden the program's appeal beyond just artists to include technologists also, and others that are thinking and feeling deeply along these lines who might not consider themselves first and foremost to be creatives or creators. We also considered naming it the 3 Years Attention Residency site, again, recalling that emphasis on the locus of focus that I mentioned earlier, but we ultimately settled on attenuation, which is a technical term here referring to the passing of attentive energy through the material substrate of the physical place. So 3 ears is deeply tied to a specific and physical site. It cannot exist anywhere else. It begins with an emergent awareness coming out of this place, and the programming and all of its related paraphernalia of the governance and the economics, they respond to that place rather than imposing a preconceived concept of some universalized program and imposing or projecting it upon any such location. So the concept of the program emerges from and reciprocates with the site itself. So you're probably wondering at this point, what the fuck is this thing? So TEARS is a DAO, although currently with only one member. It's an empty organization, so to speak, kind of seeking members. TEARS is an economy, but without a currency. So far, all of the transactions have been based on reciprocity and mutual trust, although we expect that to evolve in the future. And TEARS is a model, but maybe without a business just yet. We are exploring shared and collective stewardship based on alternative models like potlatch and generosity, and just generally keen to incubate a pure potentiality. But mostly TEARS is a test site, I would say. So typically when people talk about test sites, within the context of artist residencies at least, they refer to spaces of pure potential, I guess you could say, where attendees can interpret and experiment freely with their creative practices outside of the normal economic and social pressures of their lives. And while this is also true for the 3 Ears program, we also wanted to encourage experimentation with the architectures of the program itself. So as an artistic and attention and attenuation test site, TEARS invites attendees to explore all these thresholds of the land and of the house and of the surrounding community, which are all constantly in flux. So we encourage experimentation with also the thresholds of subjectivity and individuated identities of the residents themselves in relation. There's an opportunity here, a very unique opportunity, I believe, to question and experiment with and explore these variables in a way that is existentially unique to this specific place. And this is ultimately the underlying motivation for extending this invitation to others. So we like to think of this as a gift that we are extending. It's a gift of space, time, silence, and solitude. The sole expectation is that residents will treat this gift with humility and curiosity. So while the site is deeply rooted in its unique locality, it also paradoxically kind of provides experiences that I think are applicable beyond its borders, beyond its locality. So we might frame this as a kind of experience of resiliency. And resiliency is a keystone concept for us. This feels particularly pertinent and prescient in relation to the cultural milieu that we find ourselves in, characterized by, again, this disorienting relational dynamics with technology that often lacks grounding principles and leaves many people adrift in a sea of spectacle and fetishistic desire. And the TEARS program tries to offer an anecdote, a chance to reflect on our cultivation of resiliency. And it does this by encouraging participants to keep tabs on the energy that they're exerting upon these outlets and how they are modulating their own mediated signals. Okay, so let's talk about Perpeteia a little bit. Perpeteia is a project that has been a core part of my collaborative work with artist Curtis Tam for over 15 years. It has become a multimodal container that is central to our shared language and understanding as friends between me and Curtis, as artists and also as coordinators. Our activities have deeply informed also how I show up as a DAO contributor. So to be more specific, Perpeteia is, it's mostly a musical project. It's a fusion of our combined, although not always shared interests as artists working in this expanded field. So each of us brings our own idiosyncratic focuses and specializations to the table, and it's that friction which creates the generative actions of the project. This music could be confused for abstract or ambient music, evoking atmospheres of a kind of general nature. But I believe it's more accurate to see Perpeteia as a concrete project that isn't just about any space, anywhere, but rather about specific places, places that, as the makers, we can recall in vivid detail. So as collaborators working in the context of improvisational music and lorecraft, we often disregard discursive agreement in favor of more complex and emergent relational forms between ourselves and with the sounds that we're working on. So however ambiguous the scope or parameters of our speculative music can be, it can only be said that a search must determine it. And it is through searching and feeling into new musical epistemologies that this work gets done. So for us, this occurs by way of a love for our hearing, much more so than it does by a way of some strict orthodox musical practice of composition. So we possess a love for participating in our own project, and the success of that we judge by how much the end result challenges our own expectations of what we're up to. So these elements, the concepts, the music craft, and also the resulting artifacts dynamically form and inform each other. This process has been infinitely perplexing, I have to admit, and also very tantalizing for us. It's not about creating change for the sake of change, but rather change in pursuit of a goal that seems to be constantly shifting, even as we are perpetually approaching it. So Perpeteia is a spatial practice. One might say it is a praxis of localism as existential agility, constantly reconfiguring our roles within the collaborative nature of the project itself. And this is a formal resiliency, it is the formal resiliency of the project that allows us to adapt to whatever environment we find ourselves in. So when Curtis and I spent time at the TEARS site in June of this year, working on music together, we were able to bridge some of the compositional interests of the project with the specific qualities of that New Mexican landscape. And this experience at the TEARS program has brought me to ask a couple of questions about the nature of our experience there. So first, is there an ideal project? Is there an ideal project for the TEARS site or any program like it? Like, is this place suitable for just anyone practicing any kind of attention, or is it perhaps better suited to residents seeking to increase the acuity of their concentration in particular ways? And somehow Perpeteia seemed to touch upon this tension. Secondly, I find myself wondering how might the TEARS site serve as a platform for supporting more pedagogical intentions. So basically not just to shimmer as a sensuous manifold for reflecting our romantic and ephemeral experiences, but to also serve as an archive for formalizing learnings that can then be perpetuated, so to speak, even after the residents have left. So how might the site serve as a platform for an imminent dialogue between disparate speakers to provide them with a foundation, a shared reference point, a collective memory, and what kind of new epiphanies might emerge from this concretion of positions and dispositionings? So for us, the site served the opportunity, or it provided the opportunity to see this kind of unconscious hierarchy of priorities in our own collaboration. And it enabled us to direct our music making process more intentionally, highlighting qualities that have been present all along, but only really became apparent in the specificity of the TEARS site. So as musicians and artists, we find ourselves drawn to these negative spaces generated through our work, the emptiness, the silence, the withdrawal from the world. And in this way of thinking, we hope our ideal collaborator may be keen to help us to listen in unexpected ways, however that might be able to unfold. Okay, in this concluding section here, I'd like to just provide a little space to reflect on how Web3 might make sense of some of the ideas that we've been discussing. So I'm sure that's probably on some of your minds, like, what the fuck does this have to do with the crypto stuff that we're building? So at the beginning of this presentation, I mentioned my desire to invite a reorientation on some perspective, to question the making of a space that allows for that kind of reorientation, and the need to move towards actionable steps to disseminate this ontological reconfiguration to others. This framework does propose a challenge to the kind of banal and deeply flawed meme that we've all heard, that tech makes the world a better place. So I really want to question, what does making refer to in this context? Who composes this world we are agreeing on? Where is this place? Like, what is better in this context, and for whom, and at what cost? So if we don't define these concepts at a higher fidelity with careful acuity and subtle agility, I believe that we risk perpetuating more harm rather than achieving any semblance of good. So allow me to quickly recap here. In section 1, I proposed a kind of soft reorientation of the concept of the local. We moved away from this idea of a single source of universally applicable truth and towards a more ontologically porous and pluriversal and idiosyncratic lowercase truth. This shift is crucial for any project aiming to manifest worlds in a manner that does not perpetuate the ontological violence and harm that runs rampant in many physical and virtual worlds. So in section 2, I discussed TEARS as a particular instantiation of a site that offers an invitation to reorient without being prescriptive. So TEARS provides a spaciousness that is not already thoroughly territorialized. And this invitation into a shimmering potentiality hopes to support and inform a communal praxis for how we might redefine these virtual and physical spaces alike, and especially how they interface with each other. And then in section 3, I briefly presented Perpeteia, this project that we are increasingly aware, we're increasingly aware of the importance of its malleability, of the importance of defining the nature of the project itself in a manner that allows for this flooding in of possibility without being absolutely predetermined from the start. So as I mentioned, Perpeteia is a kind of practice of agility and resiliency, of sensing the entangled relations of ourselves and our networks, our tools, and our outputs. And it's the kind of project that enables an ontological shift that we hope will scale to a broader technological practice. So, at this point, it's extremely tempting for me to try to list and scrutinize all the many problems I have or that I've witnessed in my communities, both local and networked communities, Web3 communities and outside. But for the sake of brevity and in the spirit of this kind of ineffable atmosphere that I'm trying to generate here, I will instead leave you with just some simple contemplations to interpret however you will. I basically have been trying to invite you to consider this locus of focus also within our organizational design strategies. So we might consider organizing around alternative definitions, generative dissensus, and joyful disagreements. We might consider organizations that incubate alternative ways of worlding. We might consider becoming softer, more subtle and supple, more existentially agile and resilient. We might consider reorganizing ourselves before trying to coordinate to reconfigure our organizations. Reorganizing ourselves before reconfiguring our organizations. We might also reconsider reframing this purely deterministic and rational architecture, heroicizing exclusionary empiricisms and deploying all these disembodied analytics, and instead, entertain the idea of allowing in an influx of absurdity, of poetics, and staying open to shifting our perspective. We might consider a move towards more provisional, tentative, exploratory, and highly attenuated attention practices in ourselves, in our relationships, and how they scale to our organizations. We might consider a return to this locus of focus, to dedicate our material and attention resources towards designing better questions and avoiding these oppressive answers. So all of this that I'm proposing, this constitutes, I think, a practice of humility, a humility to exercise our individual and collective agency to become pliable and adaptive. So starting from the scale of the individual, we can then carefully and intentionally scale this approach to encompass the embedded relationship of myself with place, of ourself with place, also the relationship of the projects that we birth with the site of their birthing, and ultimately, I think, the relationships of our projects to each other, and to tie ourselves, bind ourselves with responsibility to stewarding those projects through and holding them accountable. So we might focus on how we invite people into this conversation, into this ecosystem, into these collaborations, this disposition that we're practicing and performing for each other and how we are demonstrating this for ourselves in these close, intimate, local spaces first, and to use that performance carefully and intentionally before opening up those floodgates of attention and letting everyone rush in. So I hope that I'm clear that this approach is ultimately motivated by deep love for engagement and the relational exchange as the site, as the fulcrum of invention, and a desire to try to encourage us to reprioritize our efforts towards a more meaningful and intentional practice. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for enduring all of this absurdity. And also thank you to the organizers for inviting me to fill up some space here. I guess I'll quickly mention that the TEARS program is currently accepting any inquiries from curious seekers to come and stay on the land and help me organize all of this programming. So we're welcoming Web3 folk as well as artists. So if you or someone that you know is interested in attending, please get in touch with me. And you can also visit the 3ears website, 3ears.site, which is on the screen right now. And also, you might be curious to know that Perpeteia, the music project, is currently mixing and mastering a backlog of like 5 albums, and 2 of them were recorded at the TEARS site in June, and we heard samples of them today. So we are planning a tour, and we're planning all of these releases probably for early next year. So if you're interested in, I don't know, supporting this project in any capacity or just learning more, also feel free to get in touch. And you can find me on most platforms. I'm not actively engaged on social media, but I do have a light presence there. And you can find me by my actual name, Travis Wyche, which is displayed on the screen right now. And yeah, I think we have some time for questions. I'd be open to that. Thank you again for your careful attention today and in the future. Does anyone have any questions on any subject at all?
I have a question about so I've been following along a little bit, and I noticed that you were experimenting with different, I guess, like voting distribution models. One of them being like a yeeter. This other like kind of wasn't much. I've been eyeing it, and I kind of plan on dabbling a little bit because it's just kind of I'm on kind of on the outside looking in. It's like a very interesting project in space to me, but I'm not like able to like jump fully into things right now. So just kind of from the outside looking in, like what are you what should I expect? What should we expect? Like what are you experimenting with? If I want to be a part of this moving forward, what is that going to look like? And maybe you don't know. Like maybe
I
it
do.
is all a okay.
I mean, I do to the extent that you have to understand that it's all provisional. So the main thing that you can expect is that I have been singularly tasked with stewarding this land and this house, and I have personally birthed this program from nothing. And so as of now, it's just me. But what you can expect is a continuous stream of invitation to try to identify opportunities for others to be involved in a non-prescriptive way in whatever capacity they feel like they can, in order to extend this invitation, to extend the reach of this invitation. So I know that's pretty general, but that's where we're at. It's early days here. To be a little bit more specific, there are a whole slew of, there's like a whole list of tasks to attend to, from governance to fundraising to necessary documents and legal liabilities and coverages, to also all kinds of cultural programming on many different fronts. And there's definitely a lot to discuss on each of those bullets. And so that's why right now I'm extending or like curating a community from those that I already know. My background is in the fine arts and experimental music and academic philosophy, stuff like that. So I'm inviting that community to come. I've also been in the Web3 space for some years now, so I'm extending that an invitation to that community to come. And based on the specialization, I have no shortage of ideas for what we might do. And at the end of the day, or let's say more concretely, at the end of this year, I'm kind of doing like a 1-year pilot program, right? Cohort 0 is happening now. So at the end of this year, I'll have a better understanding of what kinds of interest there is based on the conversations that I've had. And we will make some steps based on that. There at this point is very much a high likelihood that that realm of potential, there's just that realm of just so much possibility is more than anyone can fathom, and they don't know how to be involved, and it's just intimidating and etc. So I understand that I have a responsibility to try to articulate and to carve out bite-sized chunks in respect for people's time and attention. And then on the other hand, the trick to that is I am very much dedicated to not predetermining and prescribing how it should be done, only providing suggestions for how to make the stewardship more impactful. So I hope you don't feel like I'm evading your question, but
No.
again, I hope that
No.
you glean from this presentation the need to practice this kind of existential aikido and take it as it comes.
Maybe just maybe the answer is like engage where there is opportunity to engage, and it is all emergence, and things will happen as it happens. But maybe more specifically, like I'll ask you, like, should I eat?
Oh, I think of all the things that I'm up to, the fundraising is the thing that I'm most sheepish about, the most insecure about. I hate money. I hate taking money from people. I hate the responsibility and the debt that comes from that. So it's the least of my concerns, and I would say it's probably the lowest value, lowest impact form of participation at this point. So the answer is yes, by all means. And also, if you are curious to be more involved, let's talk and we'll figure out how to craft a path that's specifically tailored for you.
Nice. Cool. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the question. I don't know if PDX DAO, Christina, are you raising your hand?
I am. First, Travis, thank you. That was like obviously very much you coming out. It was beautiful. There's a lot of talking over these weeks, and this was much more than talking. So Thank you. And then also, you know, I don't consider myself an artist, but I like to write. And so when you kept referring to solitude and engagement, I don't know, maybe I just want you to kind of like elaborate on those two in the site.
Yeah, I can do that. Solitude is a huge aspect of this experience. It's core to the experience that one has with this place, and therefore the programming is kind of enveloped around that void. Sorry, I don't mean to speak in riddles, but all I mean to say is that it's undeniable that when an individual or even a couple, and that's really all the house can really support, when an individual or couple are on location, the silence is palpable. The separation from the world is very visceral, and it's not in a pejorative sense. It's not a negative experience. It's horrifying, to be sure. But from that horror, from that objection, I think there is this profound potential to reconfigure ourselves. And so that's why I've tried to emphasize that reconfiguration today. Yeah, there's no single form of artistic practice or Web3 practice for that matter that that I'm trying to attract. I think there's a place for writing or writers and interdisciplinary practices, to be sure. You should expect a profound isolation, and that has been used. Well, I'll just speak for myself, right? Because I lived at this place for 5 years up until just very recently. That isolation and that silence and that solitude can be used as to leverage extreme focus, the likes of which I have never experienced anywhere else. The capacity to focus on a single thing at the exclusion of all else is a unique quality. It goes hand in hand with that you are forced to focus on yourself and how you grapple with that extreme isolation. And that will undeniably and unavoidably infuse in any project that you bring to the place. So I'm coming to slowly realize that when people have been like pitching projects, right? They have this thing that they're doing and they want to bring it here and they want to work on it here. And I feel this mounting responsibility to warn them, like, okay, you can bring it here and you can focus on it here and it will be really good for that. But also you should be prepared for it to break, because you're going to kind of break. And don't fight that. Don't resist it, but lean into it. And if you're open to that kind of change, and if your project is agile enough to integrate that kind of change, then this is the best possible place for you. Otherwise, you're probably in for some extreme discomfort. I don't know if that answered your question. Exunt.
Hey, just a side, I feel like that, I don't know if anyone's read the book Point Omega by Don DeLillo. But it has that, it's basically about, hanging out in the desert, and it dramatizes that, like, that sort of everything changes, it just rises up to this threshold, and these guys are almost in this haze that totally separates them from what their initial goal was. Yeah, we haven't talked in a minute. I'm not surprised that we're on such a similar path. I've been, in thinking about localism for the research group, I've been thinking about these sort of multi-capital initiatives that have, call them like autonomous multi-capital initiatives that have been able to bootstrap themselves into sort of legitimacy on their own terms. this rebuilding center that takes excess building resources, and city repair that sort of goes to communities and identifies like little community enthusiasm around intersections, and have both gone through this process of alluding to this multi-capital wealth, or discovering this multi-capital wealth that is autonomous, and building structures around it to the point that years, 5-10 years later, official bodies come in and say, oh, you guys are doing, racial equity stuff, or you guys are doing climate security stuff. And they're like, sure, you could call it that. But, the results of this sort of multi-capital autonomous building are always intersectional. Anyways, it's an interesting way that, you can, again, build sort of legitimacy and participate in society on your own, participate in the broader web of value on your own terms, coming through the back door without necessarily referencing financial value. So in thinking about this, I've been thinking about the 8 forms of capital, and it's caused me to, I've like been honing in on a potential 9th form of capital, which I call virtual capital, which, when I say that, I'm referencing like probably Brian Masumi, I think you're probably aware of. The virtual is sort of a more technical version of, when you say virtual capital, you could say like, or the virtual at all, you could call it like the sense of possibility. I wrote down like, for definition of the day, the pregnant haze of potential that objects contain, something like this. So anyways, I'll just be like, I've been thinking about this concept of captive virtual versus prefigurative virtual, and sort of looking at the whole captive virtual being, so a good example for that would be like when I think of Pentecostal, like backwoods Pentecostal, like speaking into like practices like that, really corporeal practices. I think of stuff that's very informed by the land, and I think of a prefigurative, self-referential kind of savage, virtual kind of savage experimentation with the possible, and engagement with that sort of haze of the possible. When I think of televangelism, I think of a captive version of that, right? So instead of being directly in reference to itself and directly related to that sort of, like you say, that sort of silent observation of the sort of atmosphere around you, that has this really easy Monarchian good and evil lens on it that it's all instrumentalized to. So basically, to sum up, like I have been considering how to organize real, initiatives around, taking this multi-capital script, but throwing in this 9th form of capital, this prefigurative virtual, and saying, how do you relate to the virtual in a way that isn't instrumentalized by financial capital, but is but in a way that you could organize your relation to all the forms of capital in a way that's instrumentalized toward the production of the virtual. This is like I feel like I hope I'm not being like too technical, but I guess I just wanted to throw out that like there's like intense parallel between that, and maybe my maybe like a more pointed question would be like, please feel free to respond or ask it or whatever you think about all that. But my more pointed question is, when you're saying like pure potential, like, what are you thinking of? Like, how are you playing with that? It sounds like we're talking about the same thing, but I'm curious where you're at with it.
Sure,
or pure
okay.
possibility, I think you said. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. And it's that purity that is the tricky thing that I am squeamish about, because it sets up that metaphysical dialectic, which I tried to highlight a little bit. It's kind of like the necessary starting point, but also a very unsatisfactory one. I think I can answer all of that in one sweep. Let me try. I would say I would say some things. First, I find akin to kind of a Kantian metaphysics, I find the 8 forms of capital, or maybe 9, however many forms of capital, to be useful as a model, but ultimately deeply flawed and unsatisfying. I personally would not choose an economic model as the first or foundational model for all value flow, for all flow, for certainly a human disposition in the world. So there's certainly something there that we could unpack. Since you brought up Masumi, who I am a big fan of, for those that don't know, translator of Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus and the Thousand Plateaus, and also a really accomplished critical thinker in his own right on many different, very important topics from identity. And really, I think of Masumi as a philosopher of thresholds. And he wrote a book called Parables of the Virtual, Parables for the Virtual. I can't remember. And just to riff on that title, I like the parable as a form for approaching the virtual. And I think you are evoking that with the mention of Pentecostal and evangelical. Basically, a parable is like a story, right? It's a story that imparts a kind of moral agenda, or moral, I don't know if you'd say like a moral lesson. It's pedagogical, to be sure. And that's absolutely something that I'm interested in. The pedagogical aspect of this work that we're up to with these experimental economics and with these shifting reorientations to ourselves and to each other in the landscape. What are we trying to learn? How do we impart these learnings to each other? How do we formalize them without making them dogmatic and orthodox? How do we share them with a wider audience in a way that conveys that morality without the signal becoming mangled? My key takeaway from Masumi's book, Parables of the Virtual, is really his emphasis on intensities. The way that the virtual is measured, the metric for the virtual is through a spectral gradient of intensities that are always relational. And I think this is something that has stuck with me as kind of defying and breaking that foundational economic disposition towards the world of units of measure that are so clear and concrete and calculable, and maybe moving towards intensities of qualitative experience. So not abandoning the project of measurement, but maybe shifting our orientation towards the value that we are able to glean from it. Not everything can be recorded so cleanly on some ledger. Certainly if it's going to be an immutable ledger, if it becomes a world computer that consumes the qualities of the world. So I think in its most base and atomic sense, or maybe to emphasize the foundation, like in terms of the cultivation of understanding, right? The envisioning of that which we stand upon, that which is underneath us, and the cultivation and understanding in that sense. I think the TEARS program and Perpeteia and my general, speaking for myself, my general disposition towards these conversations is to avoid a rootedness in economic principles and in quantifiable metrics, and to try to move towards parables in telling stories, in evoking a language of allegory and metaphor to try to tell the story in a different way. So I agree. I think we are maybe talking about the same thing, but it matters how we tell that story. And I think that story is more about not identifying new forms of capital, not to poo-poo on your project. That sounds very exciting, to be clear. But maybe in relation to these projects I was just presenting, more about a fostering of a different kind of abacus, a different kind of instrument for tracking. And if we can enter into this space of intensity or purity, or this pure potential that you're double clicking on, then how significant is it really to track the seconds and the minutes, the inflows and outflows? And what are we left with? What is that experience, that intensity, that spectral gradient that we are experiencing despite ourselves? And how do we render it communicable? So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer. And I also don't mean to evade your question, but that's how I would kind of try to shape it.
Now, there's something interesting there about the it makes me want to double click myself on this concept of ontological shifts, because I think that's what I'm proposing to is an ontological shift, again, towards envisioning these other forms of capital in the light of this sort of qualitative or continuous rather than enumerative frame. But I think that you're sort of almost pushing in the direction of like once you encounter the qualitative and the continuous, then do the logistical frames also, like, do they even make sense? But also I think, like, to scale, I mean, my worst critique of, like, I charted Musumi going through like parables of the virtual, and then eventually writing 99 theses on reevaluation of value, and then hooking up with the Economic Space Agency and Holojane. And I was like, oh man, this is so exciting. And then he built a fucking art project, and that, not to poo-poo that, right? But but I kind of was like disappointed, because it seemed like it was going in this real direction. But I thought if this can't be formalized in a way that can scale and deal with the with the very, like, logistical and to some extent enumerative needs of life in cities and stuff like that, then of what use is it? And I like that idea of applying parable to it. I don't know. It's a really, and maybe that's another, like, sort of element of the local too, is the difference between, like, what this kind of thing means in a city, where like looking at like city repair, or what I was talking about before, versus what this sort of thing means in a space of isolation, and in sort of a different tone that, like, the land or the setting kind of demands or commands, is like another element of, like, the pluriversal, or the the different types of realities that those landscapes represent. Yeah.
Right. So it might be worth just maybe saying a few words about this ontological turn, this ontological pivot, which in the presentation I tried to describe as a simple, at the risk of being highly reductive, it's basically like changing one's own mind, seeing the world differently, a subtle shift in perspective. I like the play on words of positioning, repositioning, disposition, because just that meditation provides this very soft ontological pivot. We can think of ontological pivots at a larger scale historically being like paradigm shifts, right? Like in an extreme extent, like a revolution in thought. But I believe that paradigm shifts are an accumulation, like an avalanche effect of many small minor shifts that mimetically build up into these more gargantuan hyperobjects that ultimately teeter over some kind of fulcrum, of which that like the threshold is really just like these constraints, these limitations on our own understanding, like metaphysics, for example, which maintains this rigid separation between what, like the spiritual or the transcendental and the embodied, the physical, for example, this dichotomy, this rigid dichotomy. So like if you think about like the Copernican revolution, not to get too deep into this or anything, but like what was that? It was like in Copernicus's age, the Earth was the center of the universe, right? What is that, Ptolemy or some shit? And then so the Copernican revolution is like the realization that the universe still is what it is, but our understanding of the model now has the sun in the center and the Earth rotating around it. And that shift changed nothing and also changed everything. That's an example of an extremely radical ontological pivot. I think that's often quoted. I mean, there's similarities to this throughout philosophy, throughout all disciplines, really, right? If you think about it, if we all think about it, like Kant, for example, who is like seems to be either the hero or the sworn enemy of various continental philosophers for inciting his own kind of ontological pivot. And what is Kant's pivot? It's like basically there is no thing out there that is separate from oneself, but the self, the subject, is the object which contemplates itself. And again, like having a thought like that doesn't really change anything about the material reality, so to speak, of who we are and how we live. It also has incredible, maybe even you could say violent ripples in how we compose ourselves, how we think ourselves into being and in relation, etc. So, the reason I am I might sound a little obsessed with this idea, but I think of an ontological pivot or shift, but the reason is because I feel that we are approaching this point where there are enough minor accumulated shifts, subtle and supple shifts, the keywords that I've been trying to highlight of resiliency and agility and etc., attention, attenuation. This is all trying to highlight and illuminate this potential, which is, again, unsatisfying to refer to as a pure metaphysical potential, but I think is actionable. We can change our minds towards how we operate as embodied selves through networked relations and scale that to reconfigure our organizations. And although the material world might seem to not be affected by that, our internal reality will undergo this shift from the singular universal to that porous pluriversal, which becomes a meme which we can spread through that social cultural architecture through the substrate of our networked relations. I don't know if I'm making any sense now. I think this conversation has maybe gone very much into the abstract, as you and I tend to do, exude, but hopefully some of what we're saying provides some of the context behind the intellectual histories here. One of the very first things that I said in section 1 of the presentation was about how the meditation on localism kind of needs to begin with appreciating that it's always an intellectual positioning, right? And so I'm glad that you brought this up, because this I think we're unfurling a bit more what I meant by that intellectual positioning that comes first. Does anyone have any other questions or comments? Otherwise, we can wrap this up. I don't want to keep you hostage.
Good stuff.
Yeah, thank you for speaking and for the presentation. It's great.
Oh, I want to add that there is one more talk, I believe, on Sunday for the final talk, and then I think on Monday we are in early stages of planning, or not early stages, but we are planning a evening, sort of just like capstone, like let's hang out and talk about this whole 6-week thing, for Monday evening, or Monday evening Pacific time. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you to you guys for organizing this and for inviting me. It has served as a very valuable forcing function to try to formalize some of these ideas. I've never talked about this program, either of these projects, to be honest, in public before. So I'd be curious about any feedback, positive or negative, with how that went. And yeah, visit the website, or feel free to get in touch with me directly. I'll just put it again here in the chat. It's 3ears.site. And hope to hear from you.